Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa, France 24's program focused on the continent. I'm Charlie James, and here's what's ahead. Algerians mark 57 years of independence while also keeping up their fight for a leadership overhaul. Thousands defied a police line in protest against the interim government. A jubilant end to the political standoff in Sudan. After months of crisis, a new power-sharing deal is agreed upon by both military and civilian leaders. And leaders from across the continent to meet in Niger this weekend for an African Union summit. The goal, to finalize a landmark free trade zone between members. Thousands of Algerians in the streets on Friday, celebrating their hard-fought independence from colonial France. But they are also protesting, demanding new democratic leadership. This marks the 20th straight week of demonstrations, continuing the revolt that helped drive out President Bouteflika back in April. Earlier, I spoke to our correspondent in Algiers, Monsef Aid Kassi. He explained more about how the celebrations and protests mixed.
There was like an unbelievable crowd on this 20th Friday, coinciding with the 57th anniversary of independence and youth. Several thousand, maybe 10,000s of demonstrators have taken to the streets. It was like a festive, air to celebrate independence. This Friday, freedom is being demanded by the Algerian people. They asked about more freedom, and they asked about, they had to explain to the current government that the prisoners had to be, free. So this was one of their demands. So the celebration and the demands at the same time have been like a way to express the anger of the thousands of, tens of thousands of demonstrators who took to the streets today. So that is what they have been chanting. But they have also said that the people are the president. The people are the president today, and all the protesters who are incarcerated must be released. And they also answered to Abdelkader Ben Salah's speech. The acting president, has said that he would like to organize presidential elections, but the people today said they didn't want to organize these presidential elections with all these figures of the system. So this is why the people took to the streets today in order to demand the departure of the whole system, and they don't want incarcerations anymore. So this celebration has been really celebrated today in Algiers.
Staying in Algeria, a song that originated in an Algerian football stadium has become a protest anthem among young demonstrators. Sam Bradpiece examines the origins of its new political adaptation.
These protesters are singing from the same hymn sheet. In unison, the lyrics of La Casa del Moradia ring out. The song began as a football chant at Algerian club Ouled El Beja. Once confined to the stands, today it expresses the discontent of millions of young people in the country. It has transcended football and today is used to berate the establishment and Bouteflika's old guard.
As there was no freedom and protests were banned, the stadium provided the only release for these young people to express their frustration and send a strong message to those who govern us.
El Moradia is the name of the presidential palace in Algeria, a frequent target for protesters. La Casa del Moradia is a reference to the Spanish TV series Casa de Papel, in which a band of criminals pull off a heist stealing billions of euros. The implication is that the Algerian executive has been stealing from the country. While the lyrics point to the tragic mismanagement of the Algerian economy, they do provide hope for some.
It's good that the Algerian people express their pain through singing.
Tens of versions of the song are doing the rounds on social media, nearly all of which are accompanied by images of protests. Bouteflika resigned in April, but the demonstrations and the singing continue.
Sudanese protesters celebrating a landmark deal reached with the nation's ruling generals. Friday, triumphant crowds filled the streets of the capital, Khartoum. It's hoped the power-sharing agreement will end months of political deadlock and the violence that killed more than 100 people. Aaron Ogenki with more on how the deal was reached.
Songs, dance, chants, and V's for victory suggest a seemingly unanimous reaction to the power-sharing agreement with the Transitional Military Council. It's a win for Sudan's pro-democracy protesters. They hope the deal will spell the end of the political deadlock and violence that have predominated since long-standing President Omar al-Bashir was ousted in April.
Today is the start of Sudan's history. It is the start of our struggle. And I hope the next phase will fulfill the people's struggle.
Thank God the victory has finally come. The feeling is indescribable.
As a part of the deal, protesters and the transitional military rulers agreed to form a joint sovereign council, which will lead the country for a little over 3 years. The council will be led by a member of the military for the first 18 months and then by a civilian for the remaining 18 months. Though the protesters did make some concessions, for now, a celebratory but prudent mood prevails. The pro-democracy activists are clear. Should the military deviate from the terms of the agreement, they have no qualms about returning to the streets.
I am sending a message to the Freedom and Change movement and to the military council. If you work well, then fine. If you don't, look at the past 4 or 5 months. We will take to the streets for the 4th and 5th time until we find the Sudan we want to live in.
The breakthrough came at a time of dwindling hope. In the biggest show of force since the violent dismantling of the sit-in camp outside Khartoum's army headquarters, tens of thousands took to the streets across Sudan last weekend. But that too ended in bloodshed. At least 11 were killed and more than 180 injured in clashes with security forces.
France 24's Julia Steers has covered these talks in Sudan through the many stops and starts. She joined the program earlier, and I asked her how the two parties were able to build trust once again.
Certainly, there were doubts due to the massacre on June 3rd that killed over 100 protesters, injured hundreds. And of course, after that, the heads of the movement called off the negotiations indefinitely. But even before that really bloody day, there were stalled negotiations for weeks. We were there in Khartoum covering it, and they kept going around the same issue that was the level of representation on the Sovereign Council that was announced today. And what I've heard from diplomats on the ground and from regional analysts is that mainly what got the two sides to the table was international pressure. So that was pressure that came from the African Union. There is an Ethiopian-led mediation team that is really leading these negotiations and for a time was mediating between the two sides, but we're pushing them to actually come to the table together. And then the US and the EU and the UK have all played a big role on the ground as well in terms of doing some diplomatic back-channeling, urging both sides to come to the table together. And they tell me that it was really all along, even though it might not be the most palatable solution for some of the protesters on the ground, to have these same men who have been leading the military council on the Sovereign Council, it is in some ways the most realistic way to move forward to a transitional period before elections can be held.
And as you said, a big sticking point had been the makeup of the Transitional Council. What ended up being the count for civilians and military?
So they announced today that it would be 6 civilians, 5 military representatives with a rotating head. And as you said earlier, it will be a military head to start off for the first 18 months, or at least that's what we heard today. But it also should be noted that this 6th member on the civilian side is actually a retired military officer who is now a civilian. So that's been something that I've heard from some of the protesters is also not necessarily sitting well. But But the protest leaders themselves acknowledge that there's a long way to go in terms of convincing the protesters on the ground that this is really a viable solution, and a long way to go in terms of building democracy, and that it's not just the Sovereign Council that will be part of the transitional government, but also a legislative council that is expected to be determined in the days to come, as well as a council of technocrats that is supposedly going to be led by a prime minister. So there will ideally be other institutions other than just this Sovereign Council. That's what we heard from the protest leaders today. But as you heard from the people on the ground, there's still a lot to be sorted out and a long way to go.
Heads of state will gather Sunday in Niger for an African Union summit. At the top of the agenda, a landmark free trade agreement, one that Nigeria, with the continent's biggest economy, has belatedly agreed to join. Ahead of the summit, France 24's Mark Perlman sent us this preview of what's to come.
The African Union has convened an extraordinary summit here in Niamey, the capital of Niger, to celebrate the official launch of the Continental Free Trade Zone. Enough countries of the continent have not only signed but also ratified this agreement, which is meant to change the face of African economies in the near future, make Africa really an economically integrated continent. The president of Niger, Mahamadou Issoufou, invited a number of heads of state and governments. We're told that around 30 will attend this very symbolic moment here. However, as usual, those summits are also consumed by the crisis on the continent. Clearly, Libya is one of them after the dramatic incidents whereby a camp of migrants was bombed and some 50 people were killed. There was a meeting today to discuss the issue, to condemn, obviously, what happened, but also to try to chart a way forward. Another topic of discussion is, of course, Sudan, with the hope that the agreement reached today will indeed hold and that a peaceful solution can be found to this crisis that has been raging for several weeks now.
And finally, football news. The stakes have been raised at this year's Africa Cup of Nations. We've reached the knockout rounds in Egypt. And Friday, Morocco became the first team to exit the tournament after a shock upset by Benin. The battle came down to a penalty shootout after a 1-1 stalemate at the end of extra time. Benin will now advance to the quarterfinals for the first time ever. And after the second match of the evening, Senegal will be moving on as well, following a 1-0 victory over Uganda. That win thanks to Sadio Mane, who scored the only goal of the night in the 15th minute. And coming up Saturday, the early match pits Cameroon against Nigeria. The indomitable Lions will defend their title, taking on the Super Eagles at the Alexandria Stadium. And later in the evening, hosts Egypt play South Africa. A spokesman for Egypt says star Mohamed Salah will play. The forward sat out of training on Thursday due to a cold. That's all for this edition of Eye on Africa. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned. There's more news coming up next right here on France 24.